Oh, excuse me, I've got an itchy ear. 7:41.
Well, we all needed to know that, didn't we?
Did you ever get that? Apparently it's a sign of something if you have an itchy ear. I don't know what. This is Breakfast with Stephen and Anne at 7:42. Fleas. Oh, thanks very much. Bed bugs, probably, because they're doing the rounds, aren't they?
Oh,
No.
OK, I'll sit over here.
Time for Headline Makers this morning with our senior political commentator Nigel Nelson and his good lady wife, former Conservative advisor Claire Pearsall. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Claire, let's start with some... talking about things with diseases. Koalas.
Things with disease.
What have they got? Syphilis?
Oh, no,
no.
it's the one that begins with C.
Chlamydia?
Yes. Koalas have chlamydia. It's inherent almost in them.
Well, they've suddenly got less cute.
Oh, I was going to say, yes. They always look very cute, but they're really quite vicious.
Oh, yes,
as well,
they
aren't
bite and they have very long claws, and once they get them
claws.
stuck in you, you'll never
I've
get rid
never
of them.
met one. No, just
And they're sleepy and they spit.
Yeah, no, I was driving along outside Melbourne and actually found one in the middle of the road and wasn't quite sure what to do with it. Yeah, I couldn't get past.
Yeah.
So we sort of sat talking to each other, but I didn't want to get out and get those nasty claws into me.
But apparently they're absolutely out of their brains, aren't they? Because they eat this particular sort of...
it's eucalyptus.
Yeah. But it sends them quite high. So actually, it was probably in the middle of the road because it was just spaced out.
It was really stoned, yeah, absolutely.
It's a bit like the cats and catnip.
Yeah.
You've ever seen them when they sort of lay around as if they had a very
their habitat is under threat continuously, isn't it?
It is. So parking Nigel's chatting to a koala to one side. At the moment, the government is logging a load of the places where koalas live. So you've got... The plans at the moment are to merge 315,000 hectares of national park. They want to make a great koala national park because all of their habitats at the moment are being destroyed due to logging. We're going to lose the koalas out of existence. And I think it's really sad. It's one of those things that whenever you think of Australia, you think of kangaroos and koalas.
Yeah.
That's absolutely what we need to do. And the environment is taking a massive hammering. The timber merchants, which are big employers in those areas, up to 9,000 people employed. So I understand that sort of industry side of it, but if you're not going to replace or protect a species, then it's going to be lost. And in a country the size of Australia, you would think that they could carve out a little sort of land space.
Or not carve out.
Or not carve out.
They are creating koala corridors as well to link areas where they know koalas do well. But the calls, actually link them.
But the calls are at the moment to stop the logging until those places are set up because they're not actually set up very well. They're not in all areas where koalas live, and the destruction that's going on around them means that the koalas are just moving out or being killed, dying of starvation, all of those kind of things.
Yeah, and they were terribly badly affected by the fires.
They were, and those fires have been awful. And we have friends who are based in the Northern Territories who lost absolutely everything in those fires recently. They had to move 61 and a half horses off their land.
And a half?
A foal. A 3-day-old foal.
Oh.
So Chris Dabner and Eve Jarvis have been fantastic. They've lost absolutely everything. And I think that's what really brings home how bad these things can be when somebody loses their livelihood, their home, all of their possessions, and they're still continuing. They've still got all these horses to deal with. And then you look at the plights of koalas and other animals that lost their lives, and I think that we need to be a little bit more responsible in what we do with the land.
Yeah, well, you can't lose koalas. Anyway, I'm sure they'll be on it.
I interviewed a lovely lady a while ago who works on one of the koala reserves because after the fires they had so many terribly damaged koalas, terribly injured, burned feet and everything. You know, there was nowhere for them to go. But also an awful lot of baby koalas who'd been orphaned, and these absolutely cute, unbelievably cute little baby koalas. And she was teaching them how to literally cling onto trees and
teach them how to be a koala.
Yeah, these little babies, they slept at night with a toy koala to hug because they needed something to hug, I know.
It's heartbreaking.
So there are people doing good works out there, but...
Nigel, let's have a look at the times and the weather next year.
Yes, which is apparently going to be the hottest on record. And what this means is that we are...
Is that just for the UK or for everywhere?
No, this is global temperatures going up. What they're meant to do is they're going to go up above the 1.5 degree target, which is where we're meant to be pre-industrial levels. That would keep to the Paris Climate Change Conference agreement back in 2015. It all depends, I suppose, whether you actually believe in climate change is real, whether you actually care about it. But it seems that you get the feeling now that everyone is trying to pull back on where they were about dealing with it. That Rishi Sunak has turned around and said, right, we're not going to actually go fully electric for cars by 2030 as
You've got to be able to take the people with you, and they're not able. They're not doing that at the minute.
But the danger of all this is that if you don't lead the way, this is not going to get done. We had the same problem, if you remember, with an ageing population. We've known about the fact that the NHS would be under pressure, that pensions would become unsustainable. We knew about that 50 years ago, and everyone kept putting it off until it became a complete crisis. And the danger of climate change, assuming you believe in it, is that we end up in that situation where we'll suddenly have to do something at the last minute, and it might be too late.
But I think the real problem, and I think, Stephen, you're right, you have to bring people with you. And the government was laying down at the time some quite hefty targets, things you must have. People will not be able to buy diesel and petrol cars, which I know that and I'm pleased that's been rowed back on. But if you don't have the infrastructure, if you don't have that ability to power a grid properly, then all of these things fall apart. And you're asking the public to put enormous expense onto already hard-hit budgets by things you must do. Heating systems that we at home couldn't have, this ground source heat pump, because we don't have enough space outside in order to have it.
You did look into it, did you?
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
I did look into it.
How much space outside do you need?
Well, for the ground source ones.
They're quite big. The ground source ones, they're quite big fans. So, A, they're quite noisy. B, they're quite big. So you have to have the ground clearance in order to be able to generate that heat into your house. And also, I didn't like the fact that we'd only had a boiler put in 4 years ago. And you think the cost of ripping it all out, repiping and all the rest of it. I don't like to be told that I must have something, and then it isn't suitable. And you think, well, if it's not suitable...
Nigel, behave yourself.
But I think the government needs to be able to take you and not just force you to pay for something.
Well, are they saying you must have a TV licence or not? It's interesting in the Mail. Because the Culture Secretary says you can't send TV licence defaulters to jail.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, though, because they're almost reaching a point where they're sort of saying, well, you either buy a licence or you don't.
Yeah, I think this is the real difficulty. I mean, I do think it's wrong that people got sent to jail for not having a television licence and then not paying the fine, which is what landed them in jail. And you sort of think, with the justice system being as pressed as it is, I'm not convinced it's a priority for Mrs Miggins that didn't have her television licence and couldn't afford the £1,000 fine to end up in prison and have a criminal sentence.
What sanction do you have, though?
Use the fining system. I mean, I'm not a great fan of television licence.
We've missed a golden opportunity with the licences coming up of actually changing the system to make the licence fee work better. We're going, we're in a digital age, and and licences go back in the mists of time. We ought to actually modernise them. And one of the systems that might work is if you actually collected it as a household levy. So, in other words, that if you had the bigger home you have, the more licence fee you would pay.
Oh, why?
Well,
you watch more television.
On the basis that the higher value home you have, it's likely you would have more televisions there. At the moment, one licence covers all the televisions. Also, if you had a system like that, you could... Everyone's looking at me like I've gone mad.
Yes.
You could actually collect it much more easily and enforce it much more easily.
But why not just scrap it and have a subscription service? So if you want to watch the BBC, you pay to watch the BBC, like Netflix.
Well, if you did that, then you've lost the BBC as we know it now as an independent national broadcaster.
So?
Well, that will depend on whether you actually think the BBC is worth preserving, and if you don't, then yes, absolutely, you'd have to scrap.
But don't you think that we've just heard sort of what Labour's plans are, which is basically to tax people more, and just because you're in a bigger house doesn't mean that you have more televisions, and even if you do, why do you then have to pay for every single one? I mean, we have a reasonable-sized house. We have one television.
Yeah.
So you could have somebody in a slightly smaller house down the road that has maybe two.
Well,
it's
possible, but the person down the road, with the smaller house would actually pay less. You wouldn't.
Yeah.
At the moment, it's a flat tax.
They might watch more televisions.
Well, they might, but if you had a system, at the moment we have a system whereby you have to, you're automatically opted into it because you've got to actually go and do it. Now, in this system, say you collected it with council tax, for instance, you would then be in a position to opt out if you didn't watch the BBC. And then if you did that, that would mean that the enforcement would be easier, because obviously opting out is a much more difficult thing to go.
The enforcement would only have to look to the people
who'd opted out.
So who is going to administer your very complicated taxation scheme? Because if you're linking it to to council tax plans and things like that, so you're now going to have another part of the BBC who has to be set up in order to look through all of the land registry details, look through all of the district data details.
Well, you would do it at the same time you do a new valuation for council tax, which is long overdue. It's time we actually.
You could put a timer on your telly. Well, do it that way. Because all the people, you do get these people who spend all day watching daytime BBC, don't you?
Nobody watches daytime BBC.
And they could end up paying much less than someone like me who doesn't watch any of it.
Well, exactly. I think a subscription service is the way to go.
I think it's inevitable, isn't it, that in the end the licence fee will have to be gotten rid of, which means that certain areas, parts of the BBC, will have to look to their existence. And that may be a very modernising, but it's certainly a very healthy thing to do. Well, I mean, we all know there are departments within the BBC, maybe even channels, maybe even radio stations, that really are not worth.
It might prioritise their resources a lot better. I really wish they'd kept the local radio.
Doesn't it come down to what the BBC is actually for?
Ah, yeah, but is what it's for relevant now? And I would argue not.
What about, independent...
National broadcaster.
Independent news, for instance, be able to do more minority programming that you won't be able to get on commercial channels?
It's not independent news.
On that note, we're out of time.
We are.
Sorry. Time for the weather.